In this video, I want to talk a bit about the next two phases of the revolution. So in the previous video, I talked about how the fact that we have kind of the very initial phase of the French Revolution, which is the move to the tennis court oath and the storming the Bastille. Phase two is the period under this first constitutional monarchy government, where you have the Constitution of 1791 and also the declaration of war against some of the countries in Europe. Now we're going to be moving into phase three. Now, at the end of phase two, things in France are actually still very difficult. Just because of the fact that Louis's power has been limited has not meant that the government that came into power has been able to solve the economic problems. They're now at war, and there are going to be issues with the early period of the war. And a lot of people are just disappointed. They had really thought that all the problems in France were because of Louis. And now this new government has come in, and they've not been able to fix everything. On top of that, there begins to be an increasing anger with Louis XVI. He actually tries to escape France. He's kind of seen as the reason for the war. And so people begin to rise up with the idea that we need another change in the government. And you have a series of politicians who begin arguing that they should get support because if they were in power, A, they would be able to fix everything, and B, they would extend the vote to all French citizen men. Not the women, but the men. And so this is the period of the radical reform, which will be headed in part by Robespierre. So the first thing that happens is they are going to overthrow the monarchy. They arrest Louis and Marie Antoinette, and both will eventually be guillotined. They issue a new constitution. So the 1793 Constitution creates a republic. So France will now be a republic, and more radical than the American Revolution, the vote will be extended to all men. So this is we're definitely pushing Enlightenment thought even farther than the Enlightenment. Most of the Enlightenment thinkers argued. Now, ironically, although this is a period in which all men had the vote, it actually is a period in which most of the power is exercised by a small group of men. And that's because this new group that comes in immediately declares a state of emergency. And so power is passed to a small committee that is actually going to make the decisions. And one of the things that Robespierre and his associates decide is that you need to get rid of the enemies from without and within. So they're still fighting the wars against other European powers. But on top of that, the argument is made that the reason that the revolution has been unsuccessful, that France has not been able to be more successful economically and socially, is because there are enemies within. And so this is this hunt to capture and to find these people. Basically, anyone who questions the revolution is seen as potentially an enemy of the revolution, an enemy of France. Robespierre argues that for people who are traitors against the country, they don't deserve citizenship rights. They are such a threat that they can be basically arrested and found guilty with no protection under the law and then executed. And this is the period of the guillotines, this very violent period called the Terror. That begins in 1793 and continues into 1794, where thousands are killed. Eventually, Robespierre himself is killed in this kind of mob violence panic fest that happens with the idea that there are enemies within. Now, Robespierre and his associates also blame the church because of the fact that there is a counter-revolution movement. And they see the conservative church as part of the problem. And so they decide to try to de-Christianize France. This, again, is much more radical than the American Revolution. So they begin to do things such as playing with the calendar. And so instead of having 7-day weeks, you have 10-day weeks. So you don't really know when Sunday is. They change all the names of the month. They have it not based on the birth of Christ, but on the birth of the revolution. So there's this whole new trying to reorientate time On top of that, they start closing down churches. They're arresting a lot of church leaders. So it's really this attempt to try to create a republic that is based on inalienable rights and reason, not on an old faith that they see as causing problems. This violence, the de-Christianization, the fact that they're losing wars and there's a huge kind of counter-revolutionary movement means that there is going to be a huge reaction. So phase 4 is the reaction. This is the overthrow of Robespierre and his associates and the bringing in of another new government. So again, this is slightly more complex and different than the American Revolution. So as we come into this new phase, we have to get a new constitution. Now, many people blame the Constitution of 1793 and the chaos that followed as being based on the fact that all men were given the vote, because that seemed to prove the Enlightenment thinkers right. The average man is just not reasonable enough to vote in good leadership. So the new constitution is going to limit the vote back to the middle class. It steps back to be more conservative. They're also very concerned about a single person gaining too much power. And so they create the directory. That's the executive branch during this 4th phase. And it's basically a presidency made up of 5 co-equal men, which works about as well as you would imagine it would. So that is a very inefficient government. It's not working very well. The war is still on. The economy is still not doing particularly well. And people begin to look for the savior figure, the person who can solve all of these problems. And the person who's going to begin to rise to power is going to be Napoleon Bonaparte, who in 1799 with his supporters is going to overthrow this phase, this government, and move us into the next phase of the revolution. So keep in mind that we have this uprising. It starts out relatively conservative. It's just to try to put in a government that can put some checks and balances on Louis the 16th. It then moves into a constitutional monarchy. It gets very radical with the Republic, and then it comes back to a more conservative, middle-class focused government. This is still a republic. Louis is dead, but it's still not working well. This is not, most people's lives have not improved, and so they're really looking for someone who can bring them hope and success.